Hello my dears, I am the Raven who speaks to you. As a Brazilian from the perspective of someone born and raised in this tropical country, I feel comfortable saying that The Raven was and continues to be Poe's most influential poem for our people. It received the attention of important literary figures who had a deep, notorious love for the text. The most responsible for bringing The Raven to us, putting Poe on our radar, was without a doubt the always admirable Machado de Assis, for whom I have deep respect, mainly for timeless works such as As Memórias Póstumas de Brás Cubas and O Alienista. He was the first to introduce it to us, publishing his Portuguese translation in 1883. After him, others followed. Emílio de Menezes paraphrased the text already in the 20th century in a sequence of 18 sonnets in 1917. In 1924, Fernando Pessoa present his translation, appreciated by many. In this list of translators, Gondim da Fonseca, 1926, Milton Amado, 1944, particularly my favorite version, Benedito Lopes, 1956, Cabral do Nascimento, 1972, Alexei Bueno, 1980, and Aloysio Mendonça Sampaio, 1998, also gave their contributions. So many names only prove the fascination and admiration that The Raven awakens in Brazilian readers, something to be expected from a text that, despite its otherworldly aura, is filled with inspiring musicality, as well as incredibly precise rhythm and meter. The Raven is not only appreciated artistically speaking, it is also a source of study, bibliographic material that serves as didactic content and technical and aesthetic lessons. The Raven is a poem that, in addition to building once and for all the Gothic style that characterizes Poe, makes explicit all the melancholy rooted in his writings. And I appreciate that. To understand a little more clearly where his mind and heart were when he wrote the poem, it might be necessary to remember the ups and downs he was experiencing until the moment he finally managed to publish it. It is important to say that the precise date of when Poe wrote The Raven is unknown. What we do know is the publication date, January 29, 1844, in the New York Evening Mirror. The poem was previously rejected on more than one occasion. The period, mainly the last 5 years prior to publication, are somewhat enlightening about what ended up leaking in this poem, although Poe has defended, in his essay The Philosophy of Composition, 1846, that his approach to the poem was exclusively logical and methodical. However, I believe it is clear that, however much we use logic and technique, the character of a literary text never ceases to be emotional in its essence. This becomes quite evident when we realize the emotion present in the poem. The human aspect of our nature never leaves us, even when we are looking for some accuracy in our writing. It's not possible to losing our identity and totally repressing emotions when we are expressing ourselves artistically. Conceptually, Poe was inspired by Charles Dickens to create his own talking raven, and it was Elizabeth Barrett who elucidated and inspired the form of the composition, mainly in terms of rhythm and meter. But other than that, I imagine what we discover reading The Raven are biographical fragments of a life that is in disgrace, about to delve into it even deeper. To justify this, let me recall some historical facts of Poe's brief life at that time. It is known that his riotous and undisciplined life led him practically to ruin. Poe was rejected from both an academic institution, more precisely at the University of Virginia, and a military one, in this case the West Point Military Academy. A bohemian and adept at the illusory pleasures of alcohol, it was in Baltimore that he actually started to have a trade and earn some money, believed to have been $10 a week, writing for a weekly magazine. The turning point in Poe's life, which would lead him to more peaceful years, occurred precisely in one of the most controversial episodes of his biography, the marriage with his cousin Virginia Clemm. Virginia was only 13 years old, while Poe was already approaching his 30s. As the documentary sources on Virginia and Edgar are quite scarce and imprecise, some biographers disagree about the nature of the relationship. Some believe that did not escalate to the sexual aspect, while others claim that this was certainly the case. Considering the time, I'm certainly with the second group, and think that those who try to suggest that Poe did not have a sexual relationship with Virginia are just trying to clean up his image, which frankly has not been clean for many years. Poe was admittedly a troublemaker, given to carnal pleasures, and it was precisely due to orgies and bohemian life that he was expelled from the institutions he frequented. It doesn't surprise me at all that he got involved with a teenager, and his life history pointed to that. I won't deceive you, my listener. Several of the classic writers have bizarre and morally reprehensible episodes in their biographies, and Poe was no exception. And I won't be the one trying to hide these facts. That said, it goes on record that the marriage to Virginia did Poe good, mentally speaking. Dependent on alcohol, surprisingly it was the young woman who helped him to move away from drinking and to have some stability in the following years. By all accounts, Virginia had a huge influence on his behavior. The last years of the 1830s were, in this respect, the healthiest physically and mentally for Poe. That is until Virginia contracted tuberculosis in 1842. She died in 1847, aged 24, after 5 years of battle. And this period was precisely the one where it is believed that the poem The Raven germinated. In my perception, I can clearly feel Poe's morbidity and suffering in the poem, due to the sad and troubled moments he spent with Virginia. The blackbird himself, as the one who heralds an omen and tragedy, makes me visualize Poe's fear of losing Virginia. His biography has evidence of extramarital affairs, but Virginia was the one who, in a way, supported the writer, kept him on track. When she died, in 1847, Poe not only returned to heavy drinking, he himself died 2 years later, in 1849. I think that says a lot if you look at the whole mosaic. I believe that Lenora, mentioned in the poem, is certainly a pseudonym for Virginia. Whenever I hear this name in the poem, my mind sends me to her. The poet's poor wife, his benefactress, the woman who brought him moments of light and who was dying. The Raven is very biographical, even if the author, as I mentioned, referred to it as something technical and logical. However, I think that the great achievement of Poe is his ability to narrate scenes that deal with the emotional and supernatural experience in a very subjective way, allowing readers who associate the character with their own experiences, which they possibly had in life. This is quite interesting to see in the way Poe wrote his texts, and then we can see and feel the author as if he were the character, but at the same time we can feel ourselves in the scenes, as if the Raven was visiting and talking to us. Poe writes with impersonality, although he leaks elements of his own identity in every verse, and this promotes something rich for our experience, the possibility of reading a poem like The Raven with different optics. We read closely, in the epidermis, or even a little further away, as an external witness. And I believe that this is one of the qualities of the poem that makes it so interesting and compatible with other forms of art, such as cinema, for example. Briefly mentioning the events narrated, we accompany a lonely man by the fireplace on a dark night, consulting ancient science tomes in an attempt to remove from his mind the memory of the death of his beloved Lenora. Then he hears a knock on his bedroom door, opens and finds no one. However, the phenomenon repeats, and he realizes that the sound was actually coming from the window. In the moment when it was opened, a raven came in, landing on a bust of the goddess Athena. The man then asks the blackbird what his name would be, which he then responds saying, "Nevermore," surprising the man, who did not expect any response, although he had asked the question. Shortly after, the man meditates that soon the raven will also flap wings and take his life away, as well as many others who have passed through it before, taking away his hopes. The raven then repeats, "Nevermore," as if he had read the man's thoughts. Depressed, the man goes on to argue that the raven learned such an expression from some unfortunate master, and that this was the only thing he knew. However, such a finding is not able to demotivate him to study and discover something more about the animal, and so he pulls up a chair and sits down facing the blackbird. Staring at him, Lenora's memory returns to his thoughts, making the man feel the air thicker, as if he were in the presence of angels. He asks if this would be a divine sign for him to overcome Lenora's memory, and thus, once again, the raven intervenes, implying that the man would never be free of his memories and, consequently, of this torment. This rouses his fury, as communicating the raven and its prophecy. However, in the last act, he asks the bird if he would ever be reunited in heaven with Lenora, where the raven repeats, "Nevermore." Accusing the bird of lying, the man calls for him to return to the Plutonian coast, certainly a reference to Pluto, god of the dead in Roman mythology, an embodiment of Hades in Greek mythology. The raven, however, does not move. It continues resting on the bust of Athena, where the man then proceeds to admit that his soul will henceforth be trapped under the raven's shadow and will nevermore rise. And so the poem ends. In the essay The Philosophy of Composition, Poe made it very clear that choosing the raven as the symbol for the poem was not random. The writer aimed to rely on the lugubrious tone that the bird evokes in the collective imagination of society, something that comes from classical mythologies and still persists. And Poe, after that, starts to play ambiguously, touching on the real and the mythological, but without pointing out where the text really is located. Mythological because by evoking the symbology of the raven and making him speak, we would have the perception of the bird as a supernatural being. However, at the same time, it is worth remembering that the author makes the bird mention only one word, nevermore, something that is not uncommon in the animal kingdom, especially when we talk about birds and their ability to learn and emit sounds. Ravens actually can do that. In this sense, the poem enters both the rational and the supernatural world at the same time. It is possible to interpret in both ways. I think what really speaks louder, which is something more categorical, is the fact that the raven is an allegory of death, regardless of how we interpret. Its prophetic tone indicates finitude, reaffirms at all time the loss, the feeling of mourning, the impossibility of reuniting with the loved one and the fatalities of life. The raven becomes a symbol that represents all of this, and so it causes torture by constantly reminding of loss, thus eliciting the desolation and revolt with death, a phenomenon that escapes our knowledge, power, and which we cannot overcome. Corvid greetings.